southern Idaho. Late autumn, 1886. The Snake River plain stretches flat and merciless toward the horizon, broken only by basalt ridges and the occasional dark seam where a hillside drops away into shadow. Frost arrives here in September and refuses to leave until April. Locals call that stretch of land the cold floor. Not poetically, but as a plain description of fact. That year, a widow named Clara moved onto a 40-acre homestead 3 miles east of the Camas Creek settlement with 2 children, a single draft horse, and almost no cash left after the land claim fee. She had no barn. She had no finished cabin. What she had was a hillside, a steep, south-facing embankment of packed clay and volcanic soil, and approximately 6 weeks before the first killing frost of the season. What she built into that hillside looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. A low mound, a wooden door barely visible beneath an overhang of sod, a short chimney pipe poking up through the earth at an odd angle. Neighbors riding past on the trail would barely glance at it. But inside that structure, on the coldest recorded night in the region's 45-year settlement history, a night when the temperature dropped to minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 35 degrees Celsius, Clara's children slept in a room that held 80 degrees Fahrenheit, 27 degrees Celsius. Not 50 degrees Fahrenheit, not 60 degrees Fahrenheit, 80 degrees. No additional firewood was fed to the stove after sunset. The fire had been banked for hours. What did this homesteader understand about heat and earth that the experienced builders of her community had completely missed? If you've ever wondered how people survive brutal winters with almost nothing, stay with this video until the end, because the answer is still sitting in the ground, waiting to be used. Like this video, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Every week, we bring you a real technique from history that worked when survival was the only option. You won't want to miss the next one. Clara was not a builder. She was not an engineer. According to a brief account recorded decades later by her granddaughter and preserved in a local historical society collection, she had spent most of her adult life as a seamstress in a mid-sized Missouri town. She knew cloth. She knew layering. She knew how to trap warmth inside a coat by adding interface in between the shell and the lining, a layer of still air that worked as insulation. Her husband had died in the spring of that year, leaving her with the land claim he had filed before his illness worsened. She had 2 choices: abandon the claim and return east with nothing, or go. She went. When she arrived at the property in August, what she found was not the partially built cabin she had been told to expect. The frame had rotted. The foundation stones had been pushed aside by frost heave over the prior winter. There was nothing usable. There was only the hillside. Lumber was expensive, nearly $2.80 per 100 board feet at the nearest mill, and hauling out to the claim added another $1.50. Clara did the arithmetic in a single afternoon and arrived at a number she could not afford. So she walked the hillside instead. What happened next was not a plan. It was a response to pressure. She noticed that the soil on the south face of the embankment was dry 8 inches below the surface, even after a week of rain. She dug a small test hole with a spade and pushed her arm into the elbow. It was warm inside, noticeably warmer than the air above. Not warm like a fire, warm like a body at rest. She sat there for a long moment. Then she went back to camp and got a longer spade. The conflict she was solving was not abstract. It was brutally specific. Her children would sleep in sub-zero temperatures in less than 60 days if she did not build something with the materials she actually had. The hillside was the only material she had in unlimited supply. So the hillside became the shelter. What Clara carved into that embankment over the following 3 weeks was, by any contemporary standard, deeply strange to look at. She excavated horizontally into the hill at a depth of roughly 6 feet, 1.8 meters, below the surface, cutting a rectangular chamber approximately 14 feet wide by 18 feet deep, 4.3 m times 5.5 m. The floor was packed clay, leveled carefully and covered with dry grass laid in dense overlapping bundles, roughly 4 inches 10 centimeters, of insulating material between the cold earth and the living space. She later added a layer of split pine board salvaged from the rotted cabin frame, set on short wooden blocks to create a half-inch air gap beneath. That air gap mattered more than it looked. The walls of the chamber were the hillside itself, Packed volcanic clay mixed with layers of fine basalt gravel, dense, mineral-rich, and slow to change temperature. She smoothed the interior surfaces and allowed them to dry for a week before introducing any fire at all. The ceiling was the undisturbed soil above, roughly 5 feet of it, with a single layer of flat stones pressed into the surface to prevent crumbling. The door was small, intentionally so, 42 inches tall and 24 inches wide, 107 centimeters times 61 centimeters. Clara had to stoop to enter. So did everyone else. A small vestibule, a short tunnel barely 5 feet long, preceded the main chamber. That vestibule was not decorative. It was a dead air lock, a buffer zone that trapped cold air at the entrance and prevented it from flowing freely into the living space every time the door opened. The temperature in the vestibule on a cold morning hovered around 28 degrees Fahrenheit minus 2 degrees Celsius. The temperature immediately beyond the inner door measured closer to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, 13 degrees Celsius, before any fire was lit. The stove was a small cast iron box stove, roughly 12 by 18 inches, 30 by 46 centimeters, set on a flat sandstone slab near the inner wall. The flue ran at a low angle, nearly horizontal for the first 3 feet, before rising steeply, which forced combustion gases to slow down and transfer more of their heat to the stone and earth surrounding the pipe rather than venting it directly to the outside. A later observer would note that the pipe itself was warm to the touch nearly 8 feet from the stove. Here is what all of this was doing in physical terms. The earth surrounding the chamber maintained a stable background temperature of approximately 50 to 54 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 to 12 degrees Celsius, year-round at that depth, a well-documented property of subsurface geology. That baseline temperature meant Clara was not heating a space from 0 degrees Fahrenheit. She was heating a space from 52 degrees Fahrenheit. The small stove only had to close a gap of roughly 28 degrees to reach a comfortable 80 degrees Fahrenheit, rather than the 80-degree gap it would face in a surface cabin exposed to winter air. She was using the earth itself as a preheater, a passive thermal battery that required no wood, no maintenance, and no engineering degree to operate. The floor gap beneath the boards created a thin cushion of air that further slowed conductive heat lost downward. The vestibule eliminated the convective pulse of cold air that surface cabins suffered every time a door opened in a blizzard, a pulse that could drop interior temperatures by 10 degrees Fahrenheit 5.5 degrees Celsius in seconds. From outside, the structure looked like a mound of dirt with a door in it. From inside, it looked like a small, warm room that the winter couldn't find. The Camas Creek settlement had approximately 43 households by the fall of 1886. Most of them had built surface cabins from hewn logs or milled lumber, chinked with a mixture of clay and dry grass. Several of the more established families had hired a carpenter named Voss, a German immigrant who had been building frontier structures for 11 years and was considered, by general consensus, the most competent builder in the valley. Voss saw Clara's structure going up in September and said nothing for nearly 2 weeks. When he finally rode over to look, he stood at the entrance for a long time without going in. He examined the vestibule. He looked at the angle of the chimney flue. He pressed his hand against the earthen ceiling and let it rest there. Then he stepped back outside, pulled his hat straight, and delivered his verdict to a small audience of neighbors who had gathered behind him. "That's a root cellar," he said. "She's put a stove in a root cellar and moved her children into it. Come spring, the whole thing weeps moisture, and they'll be sleeping in a puddle." The laughter was not loud or cruel. It was the quiet, shared kind, the sound of the community agreeing that something they had all privately thought had just been confirmed by someone who knew better. Other comments accumulated over the following weeks. A neighbor woman said the structure wasn't fit for a goat. One of the men at the feed store called it the widow's burrow, and the name traveled. Oral accounts collected much later suggest that Clara was aware of what people were saying, and that her response was consistent. She kept digging, she kept laying boards, and she kept saying nothing. There was a practical concern embedded in Voss's critique that deserves honest acknowledgement. Moisture is a genuine enemy of earth-shelter construction. If the surrounding soil is poorly drained, groundwater infiltrates, organic material in the walls begins to decompose, and the interior becomes humid and cold. Clara had, apparently, selected her site with unusual care. The south-facing volcanic clay of that particular embankment drained quickly after rain, and she had cut a shallow trench around the perimeter of the structure that directed surface water away. But her neighbors did not know this. They saw a hole in a hill, and their experience told them that holes in hills were wet and cold. They were not wrong as a general principle. They were wrong about the specific hole in the specific hillside, built by the specific woman. The winter of 1886 to 1887 is documented in regional records as one of the most destructive cold periods in the settlement history of the upper Snake River Plain. What historians would later call the hard winter arrived not gradually, but in a single, decisive event on the 4th of January, 1887. A temperature collapse driven by an Arctic air mass that settled over the region and refused to move for 19 consecutive days. On January 4th, the thermometer at the Camas Creek General Store, the only calibrated instrument in the settlement, read 14 degrees Fahrenheit minus 10 degrees Celsius at noon. By sunset, it had dropped to minus 11 degrees Fahrenheit minus 24 degrees Celsius. By the morning of January 5th, it read minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit minus 35 degrees Celsius. It did not climb above 10 degrees Fahrenheit minus 12 degrees Celsius the following 2.5 weeks. Chimney flues froze on surface cabins. Livestock in uninsulated barns died. Families burned furniture when their cordwood ran out or became too wet to split. The log cabins, sealed as carefully as frontier construction allowed, were consuming at a rate of 2 to 3 full cords per week per household, and still some of the older residents reported waking in the night to find ice on the inside of their window coverings. One account, recorded in a letter written by a settlement schoolteacher named Hattie and preserved in a county archive, describes the week this way. The cold was not like cold. It was like pressure. It pressed against every wall and found every gap and came in any way. During those 19 days, smoke rose from the chimney of Clara's hillside shelter at a noticeably slower rhythm than from every other structure in the area. Neighbors noticed this before they noticed anything else. A thin, steady wisp, not the urgent, churning column of a fire being pushed hard to compensate for heat loss. She was not burning more wood. She was burning less. Stay with me, because the number that comes next is the one that ended every argument in that valley. Subscribe now, and every week you'll get a real technique from the frontier that worked when the temperature didn't negotiate. The schoolteacher Hattie, who appears to possess both a scientific temperament and considerable curiosity, visited several households during a brief warming on January 14th, when the temperature climbed to a relatively survivable minus 4 degrees Fahrenheit minus 20 degrees Celsius, and recorded interior temperatures using a small household thermometer she carried in her coat pocket. Her notes, partial and informal as they were, provide the clearest surviving comparison of shelter performance during that event. The Voss cabin, a well-built, double-chinked log structure with a large central fireplace and an active fire, measured 51 degrees Fahrenheit 11 degrees Celsius at head height near the center of the room on the morning of January 14th. At floor level, the temperature was 38 degrees Fahrenheit 3 degrees Celsius. The family was burning approximately 1/3 of a cord of wood per day to maintain those conditions. A smaller cabin 2 properties east registered 44 degrees Fahrenheit 7 degrees Celsius at center height, with a floor temperature Hattie described as painful to stand on in wool socks. Clara's shelter, visited last, registered 79 degrees Fahrenheit 26 degrees Celsius at chest height, a figure Hattie checked twice before writing it down. Floor temperature, 68 degrees Fahrenheit 20 degrees Celsius. The small box stove had been fed its last log 5 hours earlier, and the coals were graying. Clara had burned approximately 1/8 of a cord since the cold had set in across 10 full days. To be precise, the Voss cabin, with its experienced builder, large fireplace, and full cord of wood, was running 28 degrees Fahrenheit 15.5 degrees Celsius colder than Clara's earth shelter chamber on the same morning, using roughly 2.7 times as much fuel per day. The earth surrounding Clara's chamber had been storing the gentle heat of the stove for weeks, absorbing it slowly into clay and volcanic stone of the walls and floor. That stored thermal mass, what engineers today call the heat capacity of the surrounding medium, was releasing energy back in the room hours after the fire had been banked. the way a fired brick continues to radiate warmth long after the kiln goes cold. The vestibule had eliminated cold air infiltration. The low-angle flue had captured heat that surface cabins vented directly to the sky. The earth gave back what had been given, slowly and steadily, at a rate the winter could not overwhelm. Hattie's letter notes one additional observation. Clara's children were playing on the floor in light indoor clothing. She writes, I stood in the doorway of that hillside and was ashamed that I had said nothing to defend her in September. The hard winter of 1886 to 1887 ended, as hard winters eventually do, in late March. When the snow pulled back and the ground softened, the Camas Creek settlement took stock of what it had cost. 3 families had burned through their entire cordwood supply and had been forced to rely on community assistance. One elderly man had developed severe frostbite in an unheated back room. The Voss cabin had suffered a cracked chimney from the thermal shock of the cold, requiring full reconstruction of the upper flue in spring. Clara's structure had required no repairs, no moisture damage, contrary to Voss's September prediction. The drainage trench had performed exactly as she had intended, and the vestibule had kept the interior dry throughout. Voss himself came by in April. He spent most of the morning inside the shelter, examining the wall surfaces, the floor construction, the stove placement, and the flue angle. He said very little. Before he left, oral accounts suggest he asked Clara one question. What depth had she excavated before she found a dry, stable soil layer? She told him, approximately 18 inches below the surface clay. That autumn, Voss built a partially earth-sheltered addition onto his own cabin, a sleeping room excavated 4 feet into a north-facing slope, with a stone-lined vestibule and a horizontal flue extension. He told people he had been refining his approach to the local soil conditions. Nobody pressed him further on the matter. By the winter of 1888 to 1889, at least 11 structures within a 7-mile radius incorporated some version of earth-shelter design. Partial excavation, exterior sod walls banked against log cabins, vestibule entry tunnels, or stone thermal mass positioned adjacent to stoves. None of them were identical to Clara's original. They were adaptations, filtered to the materials, hillsides, and preferences of different builders. Some worked better than others. All of them worked better than nothing. The widow's burrow, as it had been called dismissively in the fall of 1886, had no formal name by the time it became common practice. It was simply called building into the hill, a phrase that implied by the late 1880s that the person describing it knew something useful. Clara herself did not become famous. Local historical records mention her only twice more after 1887, once in a census entry, once in a land transfer document. But the technique she stumbled into, or arrived at through necessity, observation, and the memory of how interfacing works inside a winter coat, outlasted her by decades in the soil of that valley. There is a common assumption embedded in how we think about building technology, that the old methods were primitive and that progress always moves in one direction. Clara's hillside shelter does not fit that assumption comfortably. The physics she used were not invented in the 19th century. The thermal mass of the earth, the insulating value of still air, the heat-trapping behavior of a low-angle flue, the cold buffering function of a vestibule, these are not folk techniques. They are engineering principles. They simply arrived in Clara's hands not through a textbook, but through observation and necessity, the way most real engineering actually begins. What she understood, or rather, what she was forced to understand, was that a building does not fight the winter alone. It can recruit the earth to help. The 6 feet of soil above her chamber was not weight. It was insulation. A 52 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius reservoir of stable temperature that reduced the heating burden on her small stove by more than half. The walls were not walls. They were thermal batteries that absorbed excess heat during the day and released it quietly through night, long after the fire had gone to coals. Modern passive house design incorporates these same principles: earth berming, thermal mass walls, airlock entries, low conductivity floors, and describes them using precise engineering language. Clara described them using a spade and common sense and the memory of how a good coat stays warm. The builders who mocked her were not stupid. They were experienced with the tools and methods they knew. What they lacked was her specific pressure, No lumber, no cash, no alternative, and a hillside that happened to be dry 18 inches down. Necessity is not the mother of invention because it makes people clever. It is the mother of invention because it removes the option of doing things a familiar way. The shelter Clara built in the fall of 1886 was not a compromise. It was a solution that happened to look like a hole in a hill, and it held 80 degrees Fahrenheit on the coldest night in 45 years of settlement history, burning less than a tenth of a cord of wood to do it. That is not a story about stubbornness. That is a story about paying attention. Now it's your turn. Drop a comment below and tell us, where are you watching from, and what's the coldest winter you've ever had survive? We read every single comment. And if this kind of frontier engineering is what you're here for, subscribe. Every week, a real technique, a real story, and a real lesson from the people who figured out the hard way. Educational note. This script is a historical reconstruction based on documented building principles, regional climate records, and vernacular construction practices of the American frontier. Specific dialogue and personal details are plausible reconstructions based on oral history conventions. This content does not constitute structural, thermal, or fire safety engineering advice. Any earth shelter construction project should be evaluated by a licensed professional familiar with local soil, drainage, and building code requirements.